Hello, everybody. I am CJ Werleman, and this is episode number 24 of Foreign Object. Americans increasingly live in a world where fantasy is more real than reality, writes Daniel Borstein in The Image, a guide to pseudo-events in America. Our sense of reality is shaped, choreographed, and manipulated by those who stand to profit most by false narratives. We are sold hope by advertisers, defense contractors sell us new wars, while a morally bankrupt political class assures us things are getting better when in fact things are getting much worse. Those who dare to challenge these false narratives are considered a threat to what Harvard professor Sheldon Wallen refers to as a corporate totalitarian state. Our corporate-controlled media not only shuns those who challenge our corporate overlords, they are removed from academic institutions. They are silenced. Journalism long ago traded news for entertainment, truth for access, and facts for opinion. Chris Hedges is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who not only describes the world as it is, but has risked his life and career to not only obliterate false hopes, but also to urge rebellion. Chris deciphers straight propaganda, corporate manipulation, and the imperialist motive. As a veteran war correspondent, he has survived ambushes in Central America, imprisonment in Sudan, and was fired upon by Serb snipers and shelled for days in Sarajevo. During the Shiite uprising that followed the first Gulf War, Chris was captured and held by the Iraqi Republican Guard. Chris is the author of multiple bestsellers including Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, and his forthcoming release is titled Wages of Rebellion. We all have our heroes. Chris Hedges is certainly one of mine. Chris, welcome to Foreign Object.
Thank you very much.
Mate, great to have you on. Mate, Malcolm X was described as a revolutionary who brought us the bad news that no one wanted to hear about. At the risk of embarrassing you, that's how I see Chris Hedges. Now, like Malcolm X, you've called for a rebellion, a revolution of sorts, so I have two questions. One, explain how the US legal, judicial, and democratic system is broken. And two, how do we rebel against the surveillance and security apparatus of which you called the corporate state's brutal enforcers?
Well, I think that, part of what I and others, Ralph Nader being another one, have attempted to do is bring that message that the system is so rigged at this point and so beholden to corporate power that there's no way we're going to bring about any significant reform, either through electoral politics, and we are now watching this farce of the self-anointed Clinton charade, which is how many weeks away are we from the election? 80 weeks away or something.
450 days.
The judicial system, especially since 9/11, has issued ruling after ruling which legitimates the stripping away of our constitutional rights. And you mentioned wholesale surveillance. These are black and white violations of our right to privacy. They have twisted language so that corporate donations to favored politicians becomes the right to petition the government. I mean, it's almost absurdist theater. So in every single and then, as you mentioned in the introduction, the media has been consolidated into the hands of, especially the electronic media, into the airwaves have been consolidated into the hands of about a half dozen corporations, Viacom, General Electric, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp. But as my friend P. Sainath, the great Indian journalist, has correctly pointed out, it's not like the old Hearst newspaper empire. These are just one of hundreds of revenue streams, and they must compete with other revenue streams to show a profit, and that's how you see the devolution of the nightly news broadcasts, which are, I don't have a TV, so I see it at the gym, but which are just deeply depressing as a journalist because there's no journalism anymore at all. It's this kind of echo chamber for the elite. So if you remember, for the whole debate, this was the official debate that was on the airwaves about Syria. It was, should we bomb them or should we bomb them and put boots on the ground, as if those were the only two legitimate debating points over how to handle U.S. policy in Syria. The security and surveillance state is deeply troubling because they all know what's coming. I mean, they have run scenario after scenario in the NSA and everywhere else on climate change, on inevitable financial collapse. I mean, they are preparing legally by essentially stripping us of our most basic legal protection, whether it's habeas corpus, the right to trial. This is, as you know, I sued Barack Obama in federal court over Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act. This is a section passed at midnight 2011 when he thought on New Year's Eve when he thought no one was looking.
Yeah.
This is a very frightening overturning of over 150 years of domestic law, which permits the military to carry out domestic policing against those who substantially support. That's not a legal term. That's not material support. So it's an amorphous kind of definition. Substantially support Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or something called associated forces, another nebulous term. To strip those who are held of due process, to hold them in military facilities, including in our offshore penal colonies, and keep them there in the language of this section until the end of hostilities, which in an age of permanent war is forever. When we won in federal court, which nobody thought we were going to do, the reaction of the Obama administration was quite telling, because suddenly, instead of just the federal attorneys, we had NSA attorneys, Pentagon attorneys, who showed up in the judge's chambers. Judge Catherine B. Forrest, she ruled on a Friday, and demanded that she lift her temporary injunction invalidating the law as unconstitutional, which, by the way, to the New York Times credit, they ran an editorial supporting her decision. And she refused, and so at 9 a.m. they were in the appellate court, the Second Circuit, the higher court, making the same argument, and they did put it back into effect. It created a quandary for the Second Circuit, because it's clearly unconstitutional to use the military to carry out extraordinary rendition on the streets of American cities. And what were they going to do? What were they going to do? So they had the hearing, and they sat on it for months. And they waited. I was also a plaintiff in a Supreme Court case called Clapper versus Amnesty International, where we challenged wholesale wiretapping and surveillance. So this was before the Snowden revelations. And the government lawyers actually got up in court and said, number one, it was speculation on our part, and number two, that if the government was in fact carrying out that kind of surveillance, we as targets would be told, which we know is a bull-faced lie, two lies.
Yeah.
And so they waited for that ruling. The Supreme Court threw it out, buying the government argument, and the Second Circuit, or the appellate court, said, well, look, the case was called Hedges versus Obama. Hedges doesn't have standing in Clapper versus Amnesty International, therefore he doesn't have standing here. That's a window into how the courts have worked to essentially aid and abet the stripping away of our most cherished and important civil liberties, and twisting the Constitution to, and Citizens United, of course, being the big ruling, to empower corporations, or further empower corporations. Now, Julian Assange and Jacob Appelbaum and some others wrote a little book called Cyberpunks, which is very smart, especially if you know nothing about the internet like me. They're very bleak. I mean, they say at best in the short term you can use Tor and encryption, but in the long term they're talking about the most pervasive and intrusion into our lives and control, and paint this kind of very bleak dystopia. And I think one of the things that has been so unsettling for those of us, and I covered the Stasi state in East Germany, and was in all sorts of despotic regimes, including Saddam Hussein's Iraq, is that when you make public the fact of this wholesale surveillance, and then the public doesn't react, it's not in dispute as to whether every piece of our electronic communications is not only being captured but stored in perpetuity in government computers. I mean, we know, courtesy of Snowden, that this is true, and yet we're not reacting. And as the great writers on totalitarianism like Hannah Arendt and others have pointed out, that in a totalitarian system, you carry out wholesale surveillance, not to find innocence or guilt, because in our species of corporate totalitarianism, guilt and innocence don't matter, but so that you have, as soon as you criminalize a person or a certain category of people, you have all the files, you have everything, and you can always hang something on them and prosecute them, especially in a judicial system which has deteriorated, as ours has, into a kind of species of just show trials. When we even have trials, 94% of those who are sitting in prison, of course, never even get a trial.
Well, that's, I mean, you paint an incredibly dystopian future, and even more chilling is the fact that you've said our corporate overlords now know this is coming, and they're preparing for it, that impoverished urban minorities are already living in chains, and that these chains are coming for the rest of us. I mean, this is very unsettling, but people are, don't see this coming.
Well, they don't, because they're captured by, bread and circus, electronic hallucinations, which now can sort of bombard them 24 hours a day. You always have to look at your disenfranchised class, because once that disenfranchised and let's say demonized class is stripped of any kinds of rights, and that is what the war on drugs has done. That is what in essence, the criminalization of poverty has done. Then you do two things. You create legal mechanisms by which police on the street, in essence, serve as judge, jury, and executioner, and we are seeing this now week after week as young African American men are being shot dead, and it doesn't matter, even if it's captured on video posts. Yes, okay, you may get the case of Garner, it didn't make any difference, but I mean, you can capture this kind of stuff on video, and even then, in the case of Michael Brown, these people are not prosecuted. But of course, most of these cases are not captured on video, so it doesn't create any kind of a quandary for the police. They just keep shooting and shooting and shooting with impunity, and the fatalities keep mounting and mounting. And that's kind of symptomatic of what's happened in marginal communities, where you have militarized police forces who can kick down doors in the middle of the night with long-barreled weapons, wearing Kevlar armor, with military-supplied command and control posts outside, oftentimes helicopters up in the air, for drug warrants, for nonviolent warrants, and that's how empires decline, or that's how empires calcify. They take the mechanisms of control on the outer reaches of empire, and then, because empires are always kind of hollowed out from the inside, largely because of the military, of course, and the expenditures. I mean, nobody wants the war in Iraq, nobody wants the war in Afghanistan, but for Raytheon and Halliburton and Northrop Grumman, these are, it's Christmas. I mean, their stocks have quadrupled, the money keeps coming in. That's why they wanted to drop $1 million cruise missiles all over Syria. So what happens is that as you hollow your country out from the inside, and anybody just has to look out a window wherever they are to see a crumbling infrastructure and failing schools and closed libraries and chronic unemployment and underemployment and slashing most basic social services, whether it's Head Start or food stamps or anything else. And so in order to maintain control, you bring back these very brutal mechanisms of control, wholesale surveillance, militarized policing, drones, and so that at this point a night raid in Oakland doesn't look any different from a night raid in Fallujah. It's the same, because it's the same mechanism. And we've already gone very, very far down that road. And I think that and having lived in disintegrating societies, so, I've seen it. I've seen what happens in places like Yugoslavia. is that at the moment that there's a crisis, whether it's caused by a collapsing economy, and even our most kind of sober financial reporters like Gretchen Morgenson are now talking about another inevitable collapse because there's been no restraint on Wall Street. We've just flooded them with free money. Or whether it's caused by climate change or whatever, at that moment of collapse, you have in place both the physical and the legal mechanisms to, with a flick of a light switch, turn this country into basically a militarized
martial law,
right, state.
Yeah.
And Arendt, when she writes in Origins of Totalitarianism, she writes about, in her case, the stateless, and she was stateless, thrown out of Germany, her passport's taken away. So she's in France, she has no rights, in the way that people of color in marginal communities have no rights. And she said the danger with that is that not only do you have the legal mechanism, but what she calls omnipotent policing. You have these all-powerful police, which we have created, so that when the society unravels, you already have both the legal and the physical mechanism to just spread out, to maintain that kind of very brutal physical control in sectors of the society that up until that moment had remained passive.
And so would you say where America is today is where Tsarist Russia was on the eve of its revolution, where Weimar Germany was before its collapse? Are we at the same place where the liberal class has ceased to function, as you've said in your book, the death of the liberal class?
Well, the liberal class has definitely ceased to function. Right. And in fact, there was far more political opposition, especially by the anarchists in Tsarist Russia, than there is in the United States. And, this was an obsession, by the way, of Dostoevsky, who saw what had happened in the latter part of the 19th century in Tsarist Russia, with the death of the liberal class, which had taken place after the assassination of, I think it was Tsar Alexander II, I can't remember. And then after that, every regime was just trying to rule with the iron fist, including the last Tsar, Nicholas. And so it would have been his father and him. And so Dostoevsky quite presciently talked about how the inevitable kind of violence, this is Raskolnikov's dream, at the end of Crime and Punishment, the same kind of visions that you saw in the end of Brothers Karamazov. And that's what happens when societies essentially embrace political paralysis, which is what we've embraced. So you have a self-identified liberal elite, and so here it would be more like Weimar, or like the former Yugoslavia before the war, where you have a self-identified liberal class that is in fact impotent. It can't act. So Obama can't regulate Wall Street. Obama's assault on civil liberties, his administration has been actually worse than under Bush, especially with the use of the Espionage Act to shut down whistleblowers, Kiriakou, Snowden, Chelsea Manning, others. The expansion of imperial war through militarized drones, the inability to deal with the suffering of the underclass. I mean, half of this country almost is now in a category called poverty or near poverty. So in essence, that's paralysis, because every mechanism of state is used to enrich and empower a corporate oligarchic elite at our expense. And the danger is that when you get, and this would be very similar to Weimar or to Yugoslavia, is that when you get a crisis, and in the case of Weimar and the case of Yugoslavia, that both came through hyperinflation, then you get a kind of enraged populace that doesn't understand what's happened. And they turn on these ineffectual elites and embrace a kind of virulent right wing. That was, of course, the fascists in Germany, but it would have been the ethnic nationalists, Slobodan Milosevic and others, Franjo Tudjman, in Yugoslavia. And they not only get rid of the liberal elites, but they have no time for quote-unquote liberal values. Those go right out the window. I mean, we saw that after the Nazis after Hitler declared martial law, with the Reichstag fire, and this is an amazing scene written in Sebastian Hoffner's book Define Hitler. You have 100,000 people go out in the streets of Leipzig, but the social democratic leadership, terrified, gets into a caravan of cars and flees to Switzerland. And so at that point, although nobody likes the Nazis, everybody says, well, at least they have the courage of their own convictions. And I think that within American society, we forget how we are a deeply violent culture. Vigilante violence since the extermination of indigenous peoples through slavery, after slavery, through the whether it's the Klan or the white citizens patrols or the whole war against workers in this country, which was the bloodiest in the industrialized world. Hundreds of American workers were murdered, thousands were injured, tens of thousands were blacklisted through vigilante bands like the Pinkertons and the Baldwin Felts and the Gun Thugs and the Old American Legion, which was a kind of quasi-fascist group of World War I veterans they were the people who were used to physically break the Wobblies. That's always been a part. We saw it in Nevada with Bundy, all these guys showing up. I mean, imagine if they had been black or if they had been, from Earth First. They would have been gunned down with, with 50 caliber machine guns. So that's always been a part of American society. It remains a part through, and the lunatic fringe of the Republican Party feeds it. Whether it's the Tea Party or the Christian right or patriot militias or whatever, and what happens is that at a moment of turmoil, those forces act as kind of quasi-official state forces. They carry out the real dirty work. I mean, literally the assassination in the streets of radicals and of minorities. The problem is that at this moment, because of 100 years of anti-communist witch hunts, all of our populist or radical movements have been destroyed. Unlike Europe, we have no residue. I mean, Europe will, France or Italy has communist labor unions, and we have nothing left. And so at a moment of severe crisis in terms of organization, we're terribly, terribly disempowered. And that's one of the reasons I've been talking quite a bit with Shama Sawant, as to whether we should try and build some kind of a national expression, a political movement like Syriza has in Greece or Podemos has in Spain, so that at least in a moment of crisis there's some kind of political entity that people can gather around. And I think that, I would break with the anarchists. I think that you need that political entity, not that movements are subsumed or loyal to that entity.
Well, you've made that point before that, previous civil rights movements, in the past we've had a strong manufacturing base and also a strong labor union movement, but that's all been destroyed. So there's really no political apparatus to build on.
There isn't. And, and even we have less than 12% of the American workforce is unionized, and most of them are public sector. They can't even strike. So, we're really in trouble, and something's coming. When it's coming, what it will look like, I don't know. But what we can't have is chaotic or anarchic or spontaneous response. We have to respond in such a way that we can seriously threaten corporate power. And I worry that we don't have the organizational structure or perhaps even the political sophistication to do that. And if we can't do that, then we are really going to see, we're going to go from Huxley to Orwell.
Are we witnessing the final death throes of the U.S. empire? You've said the road to oblivion is paved by our ceaseless lust for material wealth, imperialism, and white supremacy. Are these, the final death throes that you're describing of the U.S. empire?
Yeah, without question. The problem is that as we go down, we still have the potential to do a lot of damage and take a lot of people with us. That's what I worry about. We are a kind of militarized third world nation. We pump massive amounts of resources into this military industrial complex, which is part of the reason our economy is is so in such poor shape. I mean, the only thing we really make anymore are weapons. And it's not even a species of capitalism because cost overruns are covered, and then they're all sold to Egypt for a $3 billion, the $3 billion we give to Egypt have to be spent to buy them, and then tanks rust, in Egyptian bases until we sell them new ones. So, we're certainly far down that road without question. But, what it's going to look like as things deteriorate, it could be really, really ugly. And I think we need to use what little space we have right now. And we don't have a lot of time left. We need to use that space now to begin to organize resistance, because once, let's say we suffer a catastrophic terrorist attack and everything we're doing in the Middle East, ISIS is not Al-Qaeda. I covered Al-Qaeda for the New York Times, based in Paris. It's a very different organization on many levels, but one of the most important differences is that it's not clan-based the way Al-Qaeda was. Al-Qaeda was a very insular, almost familial kind of group, whereas ISIS has 20,000 foreign fighters, 4,000 or 5,000 from Europe, who knows how many from Canada and the United States, and we are doing just, what created ISIS? Well, it was 12 years of bombing the hell out of these people. That's what created ISIS, in the same way that when we bombed Cambodia, we created Pol Pot. And so all these people for whom bombing people is a great business just want to keep bombing, as if the very mechanism, which was industrial violence, which created these groups, is somehow going to be the solution. Well, eventually, these people are going to come back in a way that Al-Qaeda couldn't, because they didn't have the passports and because they were much smaller. And so, there's so many things that could set it off. Another catastrophic terrorist attack, a financial meltdown. I mean, fascist or totalitarian groups always need a crisis in order to come to power. Otherwise they kind of creep forward. And this has just been evidenced throughout history. The Reichstag fire being the gift that, the Nazis were waiting for, in the same way that 9/11 was the kind of gift that the neocons were waiting for in order to go into Iraq. So something happens, they're completely ready to go.
Are we locked in a forever war? I mean, James Risen in Pay Any Price, he reveals clearly, how paid defense lobbyists are paid just to continue exaggerating a foreign threat in order to justify their bloated existence. Is the U.S. now, with 50% of the nation's spending consumed, or 50% of all discretionary spending consumed by military spending, are we locked in a forever war? Is that what the U.S. is now, just a militaristic foreign war fighting entity?
Yeah, because the most powerful segment, the military security industrial state, that's how they make their living. That's how they make their profits. That's how they accrue to themselves greater and greater degrees of power. And they don't really care how many Afghans or Iraqis or Pakistanis or Somalis or Yemenis die, or how many Americans die. And there's no check, there's no control anymore on these groups. So for them, forever war is their raison d'etre for being. And because we as citizens have no ability to control these groups, and of course the political class is subservient to these groups, then that's what you're going to get. You're going to get endless war, and the longer that kind of industrial violence is visited on the wretched of the earth, the more the wretched of the earth are going to use whatever mechanisms they have to fight back. So you saw with ISIS, when they took that Jordanian pilot and put him in a cage and burned him, which of course was barbaric, but what we don't see is all the families our incendiary bombs, our fragmentation bombs have burned in their homes, home after home after home. They've seen it. They've seen the charred bodies of the children. And what they did with that pilot is what we do. It was cruder, but there was no moral difference at all. And they don't have an Air Force. They don't have, but they have people who are willing to sacrifice their lives to come back and visit that kind of destruction on us. And as the famous phrase of Jeremiah Wright, who I admire very much and was a friend, the chickens come home to roost. And he's right. He's right.
But that's so controversial to say that. It's amazing, and you're shunned as a kook if you say anything that's honest.
Jerry Wright is one of the great black prophetic preachers in this country, and that black prophetic tradition within American society has always had the best critique of empire, because African Americans suffer internally the effects of empire. So they have a kind of sensitivity to empire and how it works that white Americans don't have. And so, Cornel West comes out of that tradition. The great theologian James Cone comes out of that tradition. And what they have done very astutely, courtesy of figures like Obama or Al Sharpton or others, is essentially marginalize those figures within that tradition, like Cornell, like Jerry Wright, like Cone, and replace them with figures like Obama or Al Sharpton, who essentially is what Cornell called Obama black mascot for Wall Street. But these are just people who have betrayed that great tradition, and that's one of the reasons why not only did Obama throw Jerry Wright under the bus, but they've worked very, very hard to make sure that his voice is just not heard.
Now, speaking of that theological tradition, you were raised in a Presbyterian family. Your dad was a minister who spent his life speaking out, in support of the civil rights movement, the Vietnam anti-war movement, the gay rights movement. You yourself, you're a seminarian at Harvard Divinity School. Both you and your dad have used the social gospel as inspiration, I guess, to vigorously defend the rights of the downtrodden, and you've been a very vocal opponent of the Christian right. You wrote a book called Christian Fascist. Now, you've also been a very vocal opponent of another form of quasi-religious fundamentalism, New Atheism. You've said New Atheists are the secular version of the religious right, and that today's New Atheists are both idiotic and racist. Well, I just want to sit back and enjoy what you have to add to that.
Chomsky calls them religious fanatics, people like Dawkins, and he's right. Look, fundamentalism can come in secular or religious form. It's the same disease. And as Karen Armstrong, who's a writer I admire very much, points out, fundamentalists within any religious group, whether it's Jewish, Christian, or Islamic, bear far more in common with each other than they do with their believers of their own particular religious, organization. So, and that's why you see groups like ISIS carry out ethnic cleansing against Shiites, and of course against Muslims who they consider to be secular. So, what you have with the New Atheists is people who have bought into the religion of American exceptionalism or quote unquote Western culture as being superior to every other belief system around the globe, and because it's superior, which of course is a form of fundamentalism, we have a kind of absolute truth, and therefore we have a right to impose our virtues on others by force, through violence. That's what fundamentalists do, and that's what the late Christopher Hitchens advocated. That's what Sam Harris advocated. I mean, if you read Harris's book, which is really kind of frighteningly racist, he actually at one point calls for us to consider carrying out a nuclear first strike on the Arab world.
Then that's just a thought experiment. He's just being a philosophizer. He's just being philosophical.
It's insane. And and he says, of course it would be a crime, but given what these people, is a quote, or rough approximation of a quote, given what these people believe, it may be our only option. That's how fundamentalists think, that evil is external, they're utterly incapable of any kind of self-reflection, self-criticism. So evil is embodied in lesser breeds, lesser human beings that have to be eradicated. That's how fundamentalists think, and that's how the new atheists think. They also totally misuse, starting with Darwin. Darwin argued that species accrue mutations, but he never argued that these mutations led to any kind of moral perfection. They equate technological progress with moral progress. They use valid, science like genes, and then they twist it into what Dawkins called memes. Memes don't exist. They're, I guess, ideas. And that you can genetically engineer memes the way you genetically engineer genes. This is insanity. It's Stalin and others have tried to do it, and it doesn't work. And so, there's and that's why their politics, certainly I don't know so much about Dawkins, but certainly in the case of Hitchens and Harris, and their politics completely converge with the Christian right. So the Christian right wants to, bomb Muslims because they're all satanic, and these people want to bomb Muslims because they're all barbaric, but it's the same end. Because in the end they're the same stunted, racist, one-dimensional figures who, and I think that is what's interesting, were converted after 9/11 because they were afraid, and they want the 101st Airborne to go kill everybody so they can go back and not be afraid anymore.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, that's exactly what it is. It's a post 9/11 reactionary movement. You debated Sam Harris, and what stood out is your comments after that, and you said that having debated Sam Harris, you couldn't believe, you were shocked by his childish simplicity and how ignorant he is of world affairs. Do you believe he's come any further from when you debated him?
No, he's worse. He's part of this cheerleading for Islamophobia, and no, he's appallingly ignorant. I mean, in the debated Hitchens at Berkeley too, and Hitchens wasn't stupid, but Hitchens was just amoral. I mean, there was no moral core there at all. Whereas with Harris, he's not very bright. Like he engages. I mean, racism is a form of ignorance. When he knows nothing about religion. Neither did Hitchens. Neither does Dawkins. He knows nothing about Islam. He knows nothing about the Middle East. But fundamentalists believe they don't have to learn anything about other people, other cultures, other languages, other religions, other traditions, because of their own superiority. So it's just a waste of time. That's how fundamentalists think.
Would you say it's an anti-intellectual movement?
Of course, completely anti-intellectual. I mean, it's the antithesis of the intellectual who's constantly questioning his or herself, who's constantly attempting to expand themselves by holding up their own belief systems against the belief systems of others, who take time to learn other languages, to learn about other traditions, to study other cultures. And, I lived for 20 years in other cultures, and hold it up against their own. That's what being an intellectual is. And so, it's deeply, deeply anti-intellectual.
And you also wrote that the Enlightenment was both a blessing and a curse, and I'd just like you to expand on that.
What was both a blessing and a curse?
The Enlightenment.
Yeah. Well, the Enlightenment, I mean, the Enlightenment bought into this very biblical notion, which I don't actually buy, that human history is linear, that we are all going somewhere. And there was a great, although unread, radical thinker in France, Auguste Blanqui, who was challenging all the other socialists of the day, saying there's no guarantee that we're going anywhere. It could be worse. I mean, we the idea that human history is leading us to some glorious denouement or utopia is ridiculous. We can go backward as well as forward. And so the Enlightenment bought into that biblical notion that time is linear, which is not true for most cultures. Wasn't true for the ancient Greeks, where time was cyclical. It's not true in Asia, where time is cyclical. And, where you have periods both within individuals and societies where you have maturation and growth and decay and death. And I think that history bears that cyclical vision for both societies and individuals out. So the Enlightenment bought into that, and it also bought into this idea that human beings are rational, which is ridiculous. As a former war correspondent, they're not rational at all. And that somehow people through education could be turned into purely rational beings, and we could move forward. Well, what happened is, by the time of the French Revolution, you have the Jacobins who very much come out of the Enlightenment, and they are looking at these kind of recalcitrant groups of human beings, and they decide, well, if we eradicate them, then we can actually move forward. And this was picked up in the 20th century by both the fascists and the Stalinists, who I think are kind of the 20th century heirs to the Jacobins, that if we can just eradicate a certain segment of the population, then we can move forward. And John Ralston Saul, who I like very much, has written a kind of great book on this called Voltaire's Bastards, where he takes down the Enlightenment. The great John Gray, he's also really good, is this British philosopher, has taken on the Enlightenment. But one of the best critiques of the Enlightenment was written by Reinhold Niebuhr in this 2-volume set, The Nature and Destiny of Man. And I certainly come down on that idea that we may not be going anywhere, or we may not, I guess we're going somewhere, but we may not want to be, it may not be where we want to go. There's no guarantee that, and certainly the idea that technological progress is equated with moral progress is ridiculous. Technology is morally neutral, and it serves human ambitions, and that is why from the First World War onward, technological or industrial warfare has been able to obliterate such large numbers of human beings.
That's what Karen Armstrong makes that exact same point in Fields of Blood, and when she was talking about Richard Dawkins, he evangelizes this false notion that education will somehow save us from ourselves. But to prove that wrong, you only had to see that in Nazi Germany, concentration camps were located next door to a university. So,
well, Hannah Arendt writes about that. She gets out of the University of Heidelberg, and she says she had to unlearn everything she had been taught at university to become a moral being. And you had all sorts of figures in the Nazi establishment who, I think, was it Goebbels, I think, had a doctorate in classics. I mean, so you had concentration camp commanders who, could come home at night and play Beethoven. The being an intellectual is morally neutral, and it can serve. I live in Princeton, New Jersey, and I live next to a university where most of these intellectuals use all of their prowess and intellectual power to build little monuments to themselves and their careers and tenure and becoming a department head and getting a MacArthur grant. And it's completely morally neutral. And Hannah Arendt kind of nails it in that essay. I think it's I can't remember the book, Responsibility, and one of her essay books. So, that's right. That's right. It's in fact, when societies break down, intellectuals are kind of the least reliable group in terms of resistance that are out there.
And, mate, I just wanted to shift gears in the time we had left. And you've been one of the very few journalists who are very outspoken on global warming and climate change. You've been called an alarmist in sections of the corporate-owned media, which is ridiculous. Is it too late? Are we? It's no longer a forecast anymore; it's a nowcast. Right. We're seeing the devastating effects today. Is action too late, and is required action impossible?
It's definitely too late. I mean, I just get this from the most basic climate science reports, including, of all people, the World Bank. It's definitely too late to mitigate very serious effects of climate change. the refusal on the part of the wider society to recognize the peril that we face. Let's look at the melting of the Arctic sea ice, or the summer Arctic sea ice. Means that we are now flirting with the extinction of the human species in a very real way. When you go back and look at how civilizations break down, and Joseph Tainter did this in The Collapse of Complex Societies, or Redmond's Ancient Societies, I forget the full title, and Ronald Wright has done this, other anthropologists. Easter Island, Easter Earth is another good one. We are following the pattern of civilizations in the past. Diamond wrote about that in Collapse, and we've followed that kind of pattern. Unfortunately, there are no new peoples to subjugate. There are new lands to exploit. The difference is that when we go down this time, it will be global. And so there's no escape hatch in a way that there was for, I think, Tainter highlights 24 major civilizations that went down. And then you saw other ones rise. So there won't be any other ones that rise. I think that you can't use the word hope if you don't resist.
Right.
And I think one of the great existential struggles of our time is honestly facing what's real, and without this kind of false mania for hope and optimism, and then because it's bitter and it's dark, and then resisting anyway. And then I just wrote a book that's going to come out pretty soon called Wages of Rebellion, where I stopped arguing whether we should rebel or not. I mean, I think it's a kind of moral imperative that we're called upon just to affirm life. Whether we can finally win or not, I hope we can. But I if I had to put money down on it, I'd say it's pretty grim.
Well, and so we're seeing, I remember, and I believe it was you wrote, you're saying that the next conflicts are going to be not fought over borders and power, but more over food and water. So
right, and Turkey just turned the water off to ISIS. That's how they're fighting. They close their dams, so the water that's coming down into Syria is cut.
Israel does the same thing to Gaza.
And Israel does the same thing in Gaza and the West Bank. Israel controls all of the aquifers on the West Bank. So that's not a particularly original thought. Climate scientists have written, about this quite a bit. But you're seeing it in sub-Saharan Africa. You're seeing it in places where droughts are taking place. As the planet heats up and you begin to have mass migrations, it's a kind of mad scramble. I mean, imperial wars have always been about resources anyway. But now it's going to become about very vital resources like drinking water.
Comes down to the very survival of the species.
Yeah, it doesn't look too good out there.
Mate, Chris, this has been mate, awesome having you on Foreign Object. I know you have to get to a lecture at Princeton, so I very much appreciate your time. When is your new book coming out?
It's coming out in May, middle of May, end of May.
Okay, and you're speaking, I believe, in Toronto or Vancouver. Is it coming up?
Toronto.
But
don't ask me the date, I forgot. All I know is I'm speaking at Princeton University tonight on ISIS.
So you're taking a day-by-day basis.
Yeah.
And you've got a website where people can...
I don't tweet. I don't have a website. I don't have a Facebook page.
You don't watch
I don't have a TV. But
my
son gives me all sorts of crap about not tweeting. But I go,
well,
what's it, 177 characters? I can't.
140, but you have
140.
You have a fan account which tweets.
Somebody's doing it. Somebody's doing it, so I don't have to.
You've outsourced it. That's great, mate. Well, Chris,
all right.
Great having you, mate, and I'll let you go.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
All the best. Cheers, buddy.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.